Good, ready? All right, today we're going to consider some wisdom from the Mahatmas that we got from their letters. There were about 140 at least of those letters, mostly sent to A.P. Sinnett in India, who was an Englishman there and editor of the Pioneer, an English language newspaper, which continued to publish until not too long ago. So these are their words, mostly from their letters. The two adepts or Mahatmas that we know mostly about is Kutumi Lao Tsing on the left there and Maurya on the right. Those are pen names. They never gave their real names to the public. And these two portraits were done by a German artist, and Blavatsky saw them and said they were a good likeness, except that KH had a lighter complexion than the artist had painted. But in this photo of the portrait, it seems they have lightened his complexion. Both were very tall. Maurya soared over everyone just about. His family was very tall. And KH was also tall, but not quite so tall as Maurya was. So we'll begin with the 1900 letter that KH sent to Mrs. Besant. It's the last letter we are certain KH wrote. He wrote, "The cant about masters must be silently but firmly put down. Let the devotion and service be to that supreme spirit, alone of which one is a part. Namelessly and silently we work, and the continual references to ourselves and the repetition of our names raises up a confused aura that hinders our work." I think that Mrs. Besant misunderstood what KH wanted. He definitely wanted to stop the casual talk about masters and the constant requests for personal help from them. I do not think he meant we should never think about them or try to get in rapport with them in order to help with their work. I think KH would welcome that kind of impersonal effort. As a result of what I think was a misunderstanding, the TS stopped all mention of masters. Although the masters did not appear often in public, no less than 30 reputable people living in HPB's day reported that they had seen and conversed with at least one of them. People, if I missed something, tell me. People who never saw them began to wonder if they were living men or gods. In Masters of Wisdom, I have tried to clear up the misunderstandings about them by allowing them to speak in their own words from their letters. In HPB's day, the masters who wrote those letters were more commonly called the brothers. They were also known as adepts and Mahatmas. The term masters was meant only in the sense of a schoolmaster, a teacher, not a god. We know these men were historical figures because we have no less than 140 letters from them that are now housed in the British Library in London. I have seen and handled those letters myself. Although Blavatsky tells us that there were at least several hundred masters in her day, the correspondence we have is mainly from one called Kutumi and a lesser number from one called Maurya. The latter was her principal teacher. In a letter to their chief correspondent, Alfred Percy Sinnett, they explained that the adepts are 100% human, and except when using their occult powers are ordinary men limited to brain consciousness. In letter 85B, chronological, KH wrote, "An adept, the highest as the lowest, is one only during the exercise of his occult powers. Whenever these powers are needed, the sovereign will unlocks the door to the inner man, the adept, who can emerge and act freely, but on condition that his jailer, the outer man, will be either completely or partially paralyzed, as the case may require, either mentally and physically, mentally but not physically, physically but not entirely mentally. Neither, but with an Akashic film interposed between the outer and the inner man. The smallest exercise of occult powers, then, as you will now see, requires an effort. We may compare it to the intermuscular effort of an athlete preparing to use his physical strength. As no athlete is likely to be always amusing himself at swelling his veins in anticipation of having to lift a weight, so no adept can be supposed to keep his will in constant tension and the inner man in full function when there is no immediate necessity for it. When the inner man rests, the adept becomes an ordinary man, limited to his physical senses and the functions of his physical brain. Habit sharpens the intuitions of the latter, yet is unable to make them supersensuous. The inner adept is all ever ready, ever on the alert, and that suffices for our purposes. At moments of rest, then, his faculties are also at rest. When I sit at my meals, or when I am dressing, reading, or otherwise occupied, I am not thinking even of those near me. And Jual Kul, who was his student and a neighbor, can easily break his nose to blood by running in the dark against a beam, as he did the other night, because instead of throwing a film, he had foolishly paralyzed all his outer senses while talking to and with a distant friend. And I remained placidly ignorant of the fact. I was not thinking of him, hence my ignorance. I think most of us can even do that sometimes. Sometimes we get a strong sense of someone in trouble, or we get a sense of, we think of them just before they call. But the thing is, we cannot, neither we nor the adept can be in rapport with someone unless they are thinking of that person, unless we are thinking of that person. From the aforesaid, you may well infer that an adept is an ordinary mortal at all the moments of his daily life, but those when the inner man is acting. KH, when writing, is not an adept. A non-adept is fallible. Therefore, KH may very easily commit mistakes. KH goes on to say that the mistakes such as punctuation or idiomatic mistakes, also the terms that Sinnett had to make up because KH would write to him about some principle and say, you give me an English word for it. And Sinnett did that. Yes, so he said that he occasionally made mistakes of terms that I had to learn from you, speaking to Sinnett. It is you who are the author of rounds, rings, earthly rings, etc. When a child, HPB had visions of a tall Indian man who she thought had once saved her life. She had fallen from a horse. She was actually a good horsewoman. She fell from a horse and felt she was lifted up to safety by the invisible arm of her protector. As a young woman in 1851, she was in London at the time of the Great Exposition, a sort of World's Fair. While watching a parade of the delegates from the colonies, she saw the man of her visions in the flesh. You can imagine how she felt. Blavatsky was an incredibly brilliant woman, but she was also an incredibly emotional one. She met, she said, Moria in Hyde Park. Now, at the time of the Great Exposition, there was a dome, a glass dome over the park, and there were so many people there. It was as crowded as New York Eve, Times Square on New Year's Eve. I don't think they could have found any place in Hyde Park to really have a private conversation, even though she met him there. He probably, and this comes from Joy Mills, he probably told her to meet him in Marsgate, where there was a shell grotto that had been found earlier in the century. No one knew who had made it. It had various symbols and something that looked like an altar, but nothing that resembled the Western religions. So he might have asked her to go there where it would be quiet and they could have a conversation. He told her when he met her that she was selected as the best available person they could find to be their agent. Founding of the Theosophical Society as an organization dedicated to forming a nucleus of the Universal Brotherhood was the central purpose of their effort. And they wanted Blavatsky and Alcott, whom they selected, to form an organization. It was Blavatsky and Alcott who founded the Theosophical Society, not the adepts, though they encouraged that. With permission from the Brotherhood, they began to experiment, but some strict rules were applied. This is from KH. It was stipulated, however, that the experiment should be made independently of our personal management, and there should be no abnormal interference by ourselves. My brother and I are the only among the Brotherhood who have at heart the dissemination to a certain limit of our doctrines. None of my fellow brothers, with the exception of Moria M., will help me in this work, not even our semi-European Greek brother, the Master Hilarion. Now, there are a number of people who were encountered KH and Moria. The most amazing is a visit that Alcott describes in his old diary leaves, a visit from Moria, which was here in New York at what the press called the lamasery. Their apartment was called the lamasery because of all the Asian artifacts they had around in the apartment. And that still exists. It may be demolished soon. And I always show my Theosophical friends the lamasery. It's on 8th Avenue at 47th Street, I think, on the corner. So there were windows on the corner of 47th and windows on the corner of 8th Avenue. Alcott writes this: I was quietly reading with all my attention centered on my book. Nothing in the evening's incidents had prepared me for seeing an adept in his astral body. I had not wished for it, tried to conjure it up in my fancy, nor in the least expected it. All at once, as I was reading with my shoulder a little turned from the door, there came a gleam of something white in the right-hand corner of my eye. I turned my head, dropped my book in astonishment, and saw towering above me in his great stature, an Oriental clad in white garments and wearing a headcloth or turban of amber striped fabric, hand embroidered in yellow floss silk. Long raven hair hung from under his turban to the shoulders. His black beard, parted vertically on the chin in the Rajput fashion, was twisted up at the ends and carried over the ears. His eyes were alive with soul fire, eyes which were at once benign and piercing in glance, the eyes of a mentor and a judge, but softened by the love of a father who gazes on his son, needing counsel and guidance. He was so grand a man, so imbued with the majesty of moral strength, so luminously spiritual, so evidently above the average humanity, that I felt abashed in his presence and bowed my head and bent my knees as one does before a god. A hand was lightly laid on my head. A sweet, though strong voice bade me to be seated. And when I raised my eyes, the presence was seated in the other chair beyond the table. He told me he had come at the crisis when I needed him, that my actions had brought me to this point, that it lay with me alone whether he and I should meet often in this life as co-workers for the good of mankind, that a great work was to be done for humanity, and I had the right to share in it if I wished, that a mysterious tie, not now to be explained to me, had drawn my colleague and myself together, a tie which could not be broken, however strained it might be at times. Suddenly, the thought came into my mind, what if this be but a hallucination? What if HPB has cast a hypnotic glamour over me? I wish I had some tangible object to prove to me he has really been here, something I might handle after he is gone. The master smiled kindly, as if reading my thought, untwisted his turban from his head, benignly saluted me in farewell, and was gone. His chair was empty. I was alone with my emotions, not quite alone though, for on the table lay the embroidered headcloth, a tangible and enduring proof that I had not been overlooked or psychically befooled, but had been face to face with one of the elder brothers of humanity, one of the masters of our dull pupil race. That turban is now in Adyar at the headquarters of the Theosophical Society. There were other encounters with adepts. In August 1881, Damodar Malavenkar gave the following testimony. I have at least seen about half a dozen brothers on various occasions in broad daylight in open places, and have talked to them, not only when Madame Blavatsky was in Bombay, but even when she was far away and I here. I have also seen them when I was traveling. I was taken to the residences of some of them, and once when Colonel Alcott and Madame Blavatsky were with me. Further than that, I cannot say and shall not give any more information, either about them or the places they reside in, for I am under a solemn obligation of secrecy, and the subject is too sacred for me to be trifled with. I may, however, mention that I know Kutumi Lao Singh personally, and have seen and conversed with him when Madame Blavatsky was here, as also when she was far away. In 1883, William T. Brown, I believe he was an American, claimed that he met KH in the daylight when it would have been much more difficult for anyone to fool him by masquerading as a master in crafty arrangements of Muslim and bladder. Brown reported, on the afternoon of the 9th of November, I saw the master in broad daylight and recognized him. And on the morning of the 20th, he came to my tent and said, now you see me before you in the flesh. Look, assure yourself it is I, and left a letter of instructions and silk handkerchief. Later in life, it appears Brown began to believe that instead of meeting the master, he had been fooled, as Madame Coulomb had charged. However, KH confirmed the visit in a letter to Brown when he wrote, if an Eastern, especially a Hindu, had even half a glimpse but once of what you had, he would have considered himself blessed the whole of his life. You saw and recognized me twice at a distance. You knew it was I and no other. What more do you want? There's another slide. The Coulomb conspiracy was, they claimed they had been helped by Madame Blavatsky, I think in Bombay. I think she loaned them or gave them some money, something like that. And then they were allowed to live on the property at Adyar, the TS headquarters. And they apparently embezzled money and were finally thrown out of the society altogether, and especially off of the premises. and they vowed revenge against Blavatsky and the society. Oh, I see it was HPB declined the loan. So they were expelled, as I said, and they vowed revenge. Now, that so upset Blavatsky that she was ready to sue in the courts. And Alcott said, if you do that, I will resign from the society. I will resign as president. And finally, HPB came to her senses and she dropped it. Because after all, if she sued, and the adepts would never come to court, and she would have dragged their names through the public in a lawsuit. So she finally realized that was a foolish thing to do and dropped it. Now, what the adepts taught was largely in response to questions by Sinnett. One wonders if Sinnett had asked other questions, would we have a different doctrine to teach, you see, not dogma, because we have no dogmas, but a teaching. So anyway, mostly we get the answers to Sinnett's questions. KH wrote, Sinnett was a veritable question mark when it came to pushing for occult information. In response to his over-enthusiastic requests, KH told him, the occult science is not one in which secrets can be communicated of a sudden by a written or even verbal communication. If so, all the brothers would have to do would be publish a handbook of the art, which might be taught in schools, as grammar is. It is the common mistake of people that we willingly wrap ourselves and our powers in mystery, that we wish to keep our knowledge to ourselves, and of our own will refuse wantonly and deliberately to communicate it. The truth is that till the neophyte attains to the condition necessary for that degree of illumination to which and for which he is entitled and fitted, most, if not all, of the secrets are incommunicable. The receptivity must be equal to the desire to instruct. The illumination must come from within. Till then, no hocus pocus of incantations or mummery of appliances, no metaphysical lectures or discussions, no self-imposed penance can give it. All these are but a means to an end, and all we can do is to direct the use of such means as have been empirically found by experience of the ages to conduce to the required object. And this was and has been no secret for thousands of years. Fasting, meditation, chastity of thought, word and deed, silence for certain periods of time, to enable nature herself to speak to him who comes to her for information, government of the animal passions and impulses, utter unselfishness of intention, the use of certain incense and fumigations for physiological purposes have been published as the means since the days of Plato and Iamblichus in the West, and since the far earlier times of our Indian rishis. Now, what the adepts have to say about death and rebirth. Near-death experiences, NDEs, have provided some evidence that consciousness may exist outside of the body. The most convincing of these is a report that the clinically dead person can travel to another place, report on what was there, and had it verified later. There was a case where a woman was taken at night from her town to another town to a hospital. She was in the ambulance, dark. It was dark out. She was near dead, excuse me. And she was clinically dead on the gurney. When she was resuscitated, she told her social worker who came to see her that while clinically dead, she had left her body, went up to the third floor of the hospital and saw on a ledge outside a window a blue untied sneaker. She asked the social worker to go and check. Well, the social worker was kind. She was going to do it, quite sure she would come back and say it was a hallucination. She went up to the third floor. She found the sneaker. How could that woman have ever seen that in the dark, coming in an ambulance to a hospital in a town that was not her own town? Now, so we do have some evidence. A lot of the other near NDEs can be explained by processes of the dying brain. I know that it can be. I don't think that's what goes on, but nonetheless, we have to admit that's a possibility. But leaving the body, finding something at a distance and reporting on it and finding it be true cannot be done by the physical brain, which could certainly not get out of the brain, out of the head, and go travel and come back into the head. Excuse me. Now, the masters say that everyone gets a life review at death. I remember when I was first working in New York at a sugar brokerage as a Spanish-English teletypist to Havana, one of the CEOs came into the, some water maybe. One of the CEOs came into the teletype room, and he said, I nearly died once, I nearly drowned, and my whole life went before me in just a few seconds, and no one will believe me. I said, I believe you. So he was the first person that I ever met who actually had that kind of experience. Mary just went to get me some water. KH wrote, no man dies insane or unconscious, as some physiologists assert. Even a madman or one in a fit of delirium tremors will have his instant of perfect lucidity at the moment of death, though unable to say so to those present. The man may often appear dead, yet from the last pulsation, from and between the last throbbing of his heart and the moment when the last spark of animal heat leaves the body, the brain thinks, and the ego, higher self, lives over in those few brief seconds his whole life again. Next one. Next. HPB in the Key to Theosophy says, for one short instant, the personal becomes one with the individual and all-knowing ego. But this instant is enough to show to him the whole chain of causes which have been at work during his life. He sees and now understands himself as he is, unadorned by flattery or self-deception. He reads his life, remaining as a spectator, looking down into the arena he is quitting. He feels and knows the justice of all the suffering that has overtaken him. Now, the recently dead person may appear shortly after the time of death. There are many instances of this. My mother, who never talked about anything psychic to me in her whole life, after her mother died, they were extraordinarily close because her father had deserted the family early on when she was a child. So she became extremely close to her mother, my grandmother. And she told me about 3 days after her mother died, she said, my mother came to me this morning, so real, I could have touched the dress she was wearing. And she said, don't worry, I'm all right. I mentioned that to Dora Kunz, who said it's not uncommon, it happens frequently. So frequently, the newly dead will go to someone they love, and visions of such have been reported all over the world. Now, the adept says that there is a period after death called gestation. Dora Kunz called it a reorganization of the aura. Dora said that the newly dead slips into unconsciousness for a few days, usually, and that during that period, the aura is reorganized. And because of that, she could tell when she saw clairvoyantly someone, whether they were dead or alive. Once she told me that a member had said, "Please help find my missing son, Dora." And she said, "I can tell you whether he is alive or dead, but I cannot tell you where he is." So what is left over after the recent death is the emotional mental part of our nature. It sort of is fluffed off like the body is at death, and gradually over time disintegrates. The adepts and Dora and HPB all say that it is what's called a shell, and that mediums who try to get in touch with the dead really are not reaching the true person. They're reaching the leftovers, the psychological leftovers of the person. And so sometimes, of course, it seems that they really have reached the dead person. Now, the Theosophical doctrine does not say we are going to reincarnate as animals or insects. Once human, we do not go back to the animal nature. The bit of truth in that doctrine of transmigration is that if a person has lived a very base, sensuous life, full of lust and anger and all the baser emotions, at death, those, what we might call atoms of the psychological nature, gravitate toward animals and become part of an animal nature. So that's the grain of truth in the doctrine of transmigration. Now, at the time I met Mary, I had a girlfriend by the name of Deb. She lived in the West Village, called Greenwich Village by everyone but New Yorkers. She had an apartment in a small brownstone apartment building. When anybody had roaches, everybody had roaches because they traveled down the pipes and everything. So she'd get a lot of roaches. She'd set off a bomb and stay with me for a weekend and then go back, and everything was fine for a month. So I walked into her apartment one day and she said, "I was just listening to a Hindu on the radio, and he said, if you do evil in a life, you could come back as an insect." She said, "I looked around and said, good Lord, I'm living in a penal colony." In the Key to Theosophy, Blavatsky explains, crimes and sins committed on a plane of objectivity and in a world of matter cannot receive punishment or the results of those actions in a world of pure subjectivity. She adds, we believe in no hell or paradise as localities, in no objective hellfires and worms that never die, nor in any Jerusalem with streets paved with sapphires and diamonds. What we believe in is a post-mortem state or mental condition, such as we are in during a vivid dream. In the primary literature of the Theosophical movement, including the writings of HPB and the adepts, it would appear that perhaps there is no communication between the living and the dead. In the secondary literature of Mrs. Besson and others, it would appear that there is some communication between the two. The apparent contradiction may be explained by what KH wrote. KH explained to Sinnett that there was no direct, he underlined the word direct, communication between the living and the dead. But because he underlined adept, he implied, after all, that there is an indirect communication. KH wrote that letter when mediumship was rampant around the world. Mediums thought they were contacting the dead and even producing their spook in a seance room. That was direct communication, and KH said the medium was not getting in touch with the departed person, but rather with the mental and emotional remains of the self. After death, we slip into a stage called devachan. In the first stage of devachan, we live out our ideals, and we are not aware of the sufferings of loved ones or where they may be physically. So if we wanted to be a great singer, we imagine ourselves, and it's quite real to us, on the stage of the Metropolitan Opera. Thank God our friends don't hear us. And we can be a great artist or a great musician. And we live out all of those pure ideals that are not sullied by our lower emotions. According to KH, those in devachan may contact us. We cannot summon them. I have some evidence for this in my personal experience. We had a dear friend, Scottish dancer, two dear friends. They were sisters, extremely close sisters, Roz and Elaine Wilson. Roz developed a terminal illness some years ago and eventually died. We got a letter from her sister Elaine at Christmas time saying we lost Roz in November. Well, of course, Mary and I meditated for her and sent her peace and love. But about a year later, I was not thinking of Roz, who had probably slipped into devachan. And I was sitting quietly at a computer, and suddenly Roz came to me. I was seated. Roz was standing on my left side with the most happy, brilliant grin, radiantly happy. And I closed my eyes and said, "Hi, Roz," knowing she wouldn't hear words. And I sent her a feeling of love and peace. And I opened my eyes, never saw her again. Roz knew for sure I would let her sister know. So I wrote her sister, gave her my email address, and no sooner she got the letter, she emailed me and said, "Your letter came at such an important time. I was feeling so down about Roz, and your letter cheered me up no end. Roz always told me she would let me know if she was okay after she died, but she would not come to me like that. It would have frightened me. So she went to you. Roz loved her home, had it renovated just before she got ill, never could enjoy it. So I could not sell the house. I cannot sell the house. It's been there for over a year, just as it was when Roz died. After your letter, I can sell the house." That's what Roz wanted me to do, but I didn't know that. All I knew was she appeared to me. And once that was done, I never saw Roz again. Now, the controversy about whether or not we can be conscious of the dead may be partly cleared up by what KH tells us. He says we do not fall into devachan at once, but by stages. It's probably a little bit like when we're just waking up. For a moment, we're asleep. For a moment, we're awake, and we drift back and forth for a while until we are fully awake. It may be similar to that. The awake periods may be when we are aware of the living. Finally, of course, we slip into sleep, or in the case of death, into devachan. Now, there's a second stage of devachan. There's a second death, not like the first. As those ideals are being exhausted, the personal self begins to fade away and finally dies. That death, however, has little resemblance to the physical death that is often preceded by pain and fear. It is more like going to sleep. When the second death occurs, our inner self enters the final stage of devachan, the arupa or formless stage. It is there that we live in a state of spiritual bliss from a few to a few thousand years, depending on the karma we have created during our stay in the world of causes, the physical world. Blavatsky assures us that just as the man of the moment, at the moment of death, has a retrospective insight into the life he has led, so at the moment he is reborn onto earth, the ego, awakening from the state of devachan, has a prospective vision of the life which awaits him and realizes all the causes that have led to it. He realizes them and sees futurity because it is between devachan and rebirth that the ego regains his full monastic, that is mental consciousness, and re-becomes for a short time the God he was before. In compliance with karmic law, he first descended into matter and incarnated in the first man of flesh. The golden thread sees all its pearls and misses not one of them. Those convinced there is no survival of death will sleep through to their next incarnation. They won't go into devachan. They will just be in a deep, dreamless sleep until the next birth. Not punishment, but merely the result of their mindset. We know no less than 2 people who were totally and 100% convinced you could not be conscious after death. They were wonderful people. We loved them. They were talented. They were good people. They were so convinced. And I asked their spouse after they died, did you ever sense their presence? The answer was no. And Mary and I did not sense their presence either. They were probably in a deep sleep, dreamless sleep, awaiting their next incarnation. Now about karma. The adepts do not agree with the popular simplistic version of karma. They teach, first of all, that karma is the fundamental law of the universe. All of nature's laws derive from karma. Karma translates action, nothing more, action. We might say that action is equivalent to motion. So karma may be thought of as the sum total of the laws of motion at every level of consciousness and matter. Therefore, the fact that the earth revolves around the sun is karma. Some say there are no accidents, but the adepts say there are accidents. When a person is killed before their, what we might call due date, KH says that an untimely death will be balanced out in a future incarnation. Everything that happens to us is not personal karma from the past. If we trip, fall, and break a bone, it does not mean we broke someone's bone in a past life. It probably simply means we were careless and gravity, karma, pulled us down. Whatever state of consciousness and matter actions are created in, the karma of that action is received in that same state of matter in that same state at a future time. Now, the path, the golden stairs, and comment on a few. I wanted to comment on a few steps of the golden stairs. Yeah. Here I'm going to read the golden stairs to you. You can get them. You can get them. The instruction, the golden stairs were given to Blavatsky, she said, by one of her masters, probably Moria, but she didn't name him. And he said, give those to those you teach. So the golden stairs, which you can get from the TSA website and or from me if you email me, is behold the truth before you, a clean life, an open mind, a pure heart, an eager intellect, an unveiled spiritual perception, a brotherliness for one's co-disciple, a readiness to give and receive advice and instruction, a loyal sense of duty to the teacher, a willing obedience to the behests of truth once we have placed our confidence in and believe that teacher to be in possession of it, a courageous endurance of personal injustice, a brave declaration of principles, a valiant defense of those who are unjustly attacked, and a constant eye to the ideal of human progression and perfection, which the secret science depicts. These are the golden stairs up the steps of which the learner may climb to the temple of divine wisdom. Now, that temple of divine wisdom is our own inner nature, that capital E ego that goes on, the reincarnating self. Briefly, that's the life to be led if we are to tread the path to adeptship. We could spend days, weeks, years contemplating those points. The most difficult, I think, is to courageous endurance of personal injustice. The adepts say they will never interfere with karma, not ever, but they can if they're chelas, their close students, or Blavatsky, their agent. If something happens to them that is not caused by them, they can interfere and help the individual. So if Blavatsky makes some terrible mistakes, she has to pay for them. So KH tells us that the greatest obstacles on the path are selfishness, pride, and egoism. Blavatsky had none of those. I think that's one of the reasons she was chosen. She was completely unselfish. There are all sorts of stories we could recount if we had time to show how she was unselfish. So briefly, that's the life to be lived. KH tells us that the greatest obstacles, as I said, are selfishness, pride, and egoism. Many today wonder if the masters are still living, if they are in contact with some individuals as they were in the past. We do not know for sure, but we must remember that the adept is not the physical body. Another quote from a Mahatma letter: "It is upon the serene and placid surfaces of the unruffled mind that the visions gathered from the invisible find a representation in the visible world." And the Buddha, a mind unruffled by the vagaries of fortune, from sorrow freed, from defilements cleansed, from fear liberated, this is the greatest blessing. So people have wondered, do these adepts still exist and do they communicate with anyone? Remembering that the adept is one that can identify with and function from a state of consciousness called buddhi manas, the true inner self. And the adept is neither male nor female. The adept can incarnate as a male or female. My personal belief is that they probably chose a male body more often, not because there was the men were better than women, but simply because if they chose a female body, they would have to deal with the menses. And who would have believed a woman until recently? And even now, many people will not. But at least in this country, women are gaining more of their rights, equal rights with the men. So the adept, we must remember, is neither male nor female. Now, there is some evidence that at least one person in the late 1900s was in direct contact with the two masters we know as KH and M. Moria. It was Dora Kuntz, past president of the Theosophical Society in America. As a friend of Dora's for about 40 years, I'd like to say a little about what I knew of her, and then to read a short portion of a talk she gave in Philadelphia in 1955. In some ways, Dora was similar to HPB. When some members complained about the difficult personality of HPB, KH responded she could not help it because they had to remove one of her principles. He added, she is a psychological cripple. He never explained what that was, and I have no idea. But in any case, apparently they had to do something that kept them in complete rapport at all times with Blavatsky or their chelas, so that they could stop that chela or Blavatsky from spilling secrets that might be misused. Dora was like that. She could be a spiritual giant. When she talked about the adepts, you felt you were in their presence. She could be a difficult character, like the little girl with the curl. When she was good, she was very, very good. And when she was bad, she was horrid. As many of you know, KH wrote, we have one word for all aspirants, try. When Dora was president of the Theosophical Society in America, she lived in the main building on the occult campus. One night, a member was walking by her door in the wee hours of the morning, and she heard Dora saying, I am trying, I am trying. Dora was in her room alone. Could it be she was speaking with one of the adepts? I'd like to close by reading a portion of Dora's talk on the masters. In it, she describes the facial expressions of the masters, something that is in no theosophical literature, and something she would never have done had she not seen them. Dora always said when she gave a lecture, I am not talking from the books, even though she knew the literature thoroughly. I am talking from my personal experience. When she said, I am speaking from my own personal experience. In her talk on the Masters in 1955, Dora described the Masters in her own words from her own experience. Here is a transcript of part of that talk. When you know the Masters, you cannot help but be devoted to them. But they do not want us to worship them. And the Theosophical Society was not meant to be a religious organization. I think that sometimes we put the Masters on a pedestal and feel like little worms below. Some think if they can feel a tremendous sense of devotion to the Masters, they can sit in a chair and do nothing, like being in a monastery. That is not enough. The Theosophical was not founded on that principle, and it will not fulfill its destiny if we unconsciously treat it like a church. The churches have a tremendous work to fulfill, uplifting the people, giving them that faith and bringing out their devotion. Devotion is a fine thing, but the Masters require a very great deal more. We have to feel a sense of being colleagues with the Masters, engaged in a great work together. As I said before, the more you know about the Masters, you cannot help but have a feeling of love and reverence. But that is not why the Theosophical Society is in existence. There are thousands of members of the Theosophical Society, but there are very few Theosophists. It is very easy to sign a piece of paper and say you want to join the Theosophical Society and that you believe in brotherhood, but brotherhood is something we should live instead of talking about. The Theosophical Society is a testing ground for brotherhood. It is the place to let ourselves grow, to let ourselves understand that we are not to be dogmatic, to let ourselves learn to get along with one another, whether we like one another or not. You must be willing to have differences of opinion. You must be willing to stand the acid test, even if you are called names. It is you who are being tested. If you walk out because one individual says something nasty to you, you are failing the test of brotherhood. How can I try to convey something of the experiencing of the Masters? I shall try to give a brief description of what I think are some of the characteristics of the two Masters that we always talk about, Master KH and Master Moria. As I said previously, there has never been a time in my life when the Masters have not been real to me, and I shall describe them from my point of view. Master Moria was the master of HPB. If you read the Master's letters, you will get some sense of his personality. As you know, he is an Indian. He is very tall, and he comes from a very princely family. I think that if you are in his presence, you have that sense that you are in the presence of somebody who is every inch a king. That feeling really is true because he gives a sense of absolute integrity. That may sound a strange word to use. What is meant by absolute integrity? All of us have masks. All of us think in terms of little things that are not true. If you are in the Master's presence for the moment, all of that gets wiped out. All of the little things which are not really true, which are not part of what we see as ourselves, are wiped out. If you are in his presence, you meet a person who is so absolutely in the center of his being, who is so absolutely true that you yourself get the sense of being thrown back into the absolute center of yourself. You get a sense even of the greatness and integrity of yourself. In his presence, you could not think of something childish or mean. Of course, there is also a tremendous sense of strength, of a strength which enables you to carry something through to the end which you have started. It is a strength that has no ending. In the Master's letters, you will notice he is very economical with words. There is a complete economy in emotion, in movement, and in everything, even in his looks. He has a tremendously noble face, but whatever he feels is not reflected in it. It is a steady face. The facial muscles change very little because it is the face of a person who is completely at one with himself and who is cast in a solid granite mold of unity, integrity, and strength. I think that is a brief personification of the Master Morya. The Master KH is totally different in many respects. Their two personalities could not be more different. Yet they have a sense of tremendous devotion to one another, as you will notice in the letters. They have been colleagues for so many lives. It is really a beautiful thing to notice how they work together. The Master KH is tall, but not as tall as the Master Morya. He has a very noble face. Whatever he feels shows. Pictures could never do him justice because his expression varies from moment to moment. He writes beautiful English in the Mahatma letters. He has great feeling for music and the arts. I think that what the Master KH conveys is the feeling of love. You might think that if you were in the Master's presence, you would feel very small and shy. Perhaps the Master Morya would give you that feeling a little, but not the Master KH. You would have a sense of expanding consciousness, just as you would with the Master Morya. But the Master KH has the great gift of making a person feel as though you had known him all your life. Don't you think that's a great gift of love? He is a person who is so much a personification of love that it draws from me all the love that I am capable of, and so it draws from any person who comes into contact with him a sense of outgoing love. That sense of outgoing love is finally a sense of being yourself, a perfect being. Many want to get in touch with the Masters, but they say they do not respond to personal requests for meetings, either physically or out-of-body meetings. The Masters say they are only interested in working with people who are motivated to help them in their work for humanity. In one letter, KH says, anyone actively doing their best for humanity is automatically in the sphere of their influence. From my own experience, I can say that can be done. Some years ago, I gave a week program on the Mahatma letters at our national headquarters. I left the last day for questions and comments. I asked the group to bring questions and/or write them on a piece of paper without names and put them in a basket. We would discuss them. The last day arrived. I asked, are there any questions? There were none. I asked for written questions. There were none. I had over an hour with nothing prepared. I got quiet and I said what I wanted to say about the Masters. I was so inspired. I felt as though I were a witness to what I was saying. Years later, I told Dora Kuntz about that experience. Dora would never listen to what she thought was nonsense. She might literally call you an idiot and walk away from you. As I spoke about the incident, she smiled, quietly shook her head in the affirmative. She knew what had happened. Somehow I had gotten into the sphere of influence from the Masters. I might add that after that talk, John Alger, who was then president, came up to me. He was a fellow Scorpio. He said, Ed, I'm going to do something very un-Scorpio-like. I said, what are you going to do, John? He said, I'm going to hug you for that. And he did. I'm convinced that anyone who wants to work with for the greater good of humanity will be within the sphere of their influence. If that effort is personal, it will fail. If it is impersonal, it will succeed. Thank you.